He hadn't planned on being stuck in the middle of nowhere. In fact, planning was what he always relied on. His entire life up to that moment had been a chain of carefully measured decisions, laid out like the iron tracks of a railway, predictable and relentless. Each morning began with alarms that cut through dreams like a blade, waking him before dawn so he could get a head start on the day. Each evening ended with the glow of spreadsheets on his laptop, long after colleagues had gone home, long after the city outside had slowed into its nightly lull of traffic, neon, and sirens. He lived in a rhythm dictated not by his own desires, but by obligations to his job, to expectations, to the unspoken rules of urban survival. He thought he knew what tired meant, but the kind of exhaustion he carried was something different. It was the kind of weariness that sank deep into the bones, hollowing out the spirit. For months he had felt it pressing in on him. Deadlines multiplied. Colleagues leaned on him more heavily. Superiors demanded more. And through it all, he carried himself with the same uncomplaining steadiness that people admired. Reliable, they called him. Consistent, as though those words were medals pinned to his chest. Yet what those words truly meant was that no one noticed how close he was to breaking. They didn't see the mornings when he sat at the edge of his bed, hands pressed to his temples, trying to summon the strength to stand. They didn't see the nights when his apartment, quiet and empty, felt less like a refuge and more like a cell. They didn't know how many times he stared out his window at the blinking lights of the city and wondered what it would be like to walk away from it all. That was when the idea of the cabin first came to him, not as a plan at first, but as a longing, a fantasy that flickered across his mind in the small hours of the morning, when the silence of his apartment was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of neon lights seeping through the curtains. In those moments, he imagined himself somewhere else, somewhere green, somewhere still, where the air smelled of earth and pine instead of exhaust fumes. He wanted a silence that wasn't the sterile silence of urban loneliness, but a living silence, a silence filled with the subtle sounds of wind and birdsong. He wanted to be far from crowds, far from the endless churn of news cycles, emails, demands, faces. One evening, drained from another 14-hour day, he found himself scrolling mindlessly through his phone when an image stopped him cold. It was a photograph, a simple advertisement, really, of a rustic log cabin nestled between trees aflame with autumn colors. The caption beneath read, "Your wilderness retreat, where silence is sacred." Something in him jolted awake. He lingered on that image, feeling the ache of yearning, like a physical pain. He told himself it was silly. He told himself he didn't have the time, didn't have the luxury. But the thought wouldn't leave. The image followed him into his dreams, and the next morning, while wedged into a packed subway car, he found himself closing his eyes and pretending he was standing on that porch, breathing in mountain air instead of sweat and iron and electricity. By the end of that week, he gave in. He booked the cabin. 3 nights, that was all. 3 nights away from the city, away from responsibility, away from the constant noise. It felt illicit, almost shameful, like stealing something that didn't belong to him. He told no one, not his colleagues, not his family, not the few friends he had left. This trip wasn't for them. It was his rebellion, his escape, his secret. From that moment on, he carried the thought of the cabin like a talisman. Through endless meetings, he imagined the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. Through snarled commutes, he pictured the stillness of a lake at dawn. Through late nights, staring at numbers until they blurred, he held the image of firelight flickering against rough wooden walls. That hope, fragile and flickering, kept him moving when exhaustion threatened to grind him down completely. When the day finally came, he packed with care. He chose his items not as a traveler, but as a man preparing for pilgrimage. A stack of books he had promised himself he would one day read. A journal, blank and waiting. A bag of his favorite coffee beans, because he wanted to savor mornings. Slowly, a few clothes, plain and practical. He did not pack his work laptop. That, more than anything, felt like defiance. The drive itself was transformative. With each passing mile, the city fell away. Steel towers dissolved into low suburbs, then into wide stretches of farmland, then into rolling hills, brushed gold. With autumn, he rolled down the window and inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with air sharp and clean, tasting of soil and rain. The weight on his shoulders eased. The farther he drove, the lighter he became. Forests swallowed the road, trees, rising high on either side, like guardians of another realm. The branches arched above, filtering sunlight into shifting patterns that danced across his windshield. He slowed the car, not just out of caution, but out of reverence. It felt like entering a sacred place, one that demanded silence and humility. Last, the gravel path appeared, marked only by a wooden sign, leaning slightly with age. He turned in, tires crunching over stone, and the cabin revealed itself. It was smaller than he expected, and more beautiful. Weathered wood darkened by years of storms, a stone chimney etched with moss, a porch that faced the forest as though it had been built for nothing but watching the world. He stopped the car and stepped out, letting the door slam shut behind him. For a moment, he simply stood there, drinking it in. The air was cold and clean. Pines towered around him, their scent sharp and grounding. Somewhere distant, water trickled, and closer still, birds rustled in branches. It was everything he had dreamed, and more. He could feel the city falling from him, piece by piece, dissolving into the forest floor. Bags slung over his shoulder, he climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned beneath his weight, but it wasn't the strained groan of a city apartment's floorboards. It was the honest creak of something built by hand, something alive. He reached into his pocket for the key the rental company had mailed him, savoring the anticipation of stepping into a space that would be entirely his for the next 3 days. But when he slid the key into the lock, something was wrong. The door gave way too easily. It was unlocked. He frowned. That wasn't how it was supposed to be. They had assured him the cabin would be secured. His pulse quickened. He pushed the door gently and stepped inside, expecting stillness, emptiness. The faint must of disuse. Instead, he stopped short. There were bags on the floor, not his. For a moment, he couldn't move. His mind stumbled over the sight, trying to make sense of it. His sanctuary, his secret place, already held the presence of another. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something sweet, something domestic. The room was not abandoned but inhabited. His chest tightened, and then he heard it, the sound of footsteps on the porch behind him. He turned, heart thudding, and saw her. A woman, heavy-set, bundled in a worn coat, struggling with 2 oversized bags. Her face was flushed from exertion, strands of hair escaping a loose braid. Her eyes widened as she saw him, surprise flashing to guilt. Oh, I didn't realize someone was already here," she said quickly, voice soft and apologetic, as though she knew she was intruding. She shifted her bags, nearly dropping one. "I think there's been some mistake with the booking." Frustration surged inside him, sharp and immediate. This wasn't what he signed up for. This wasn't the solitude he had craved. This was intrusion, disruption, the collapse of the fragile dream he had been nurturing for weeks. The sanctuary he had imagined shattered in an instant, replaced by claustrophobia. And worse, it wasn't just any stranger. His gaze, against his will, took her in the width of her frame, the way she filled the doorway, the way her presence seemed to shrink the space around him. Something recoiled inside him, not from her humanity, but from the betrayal of his vision. He had wanted silence, emptiness, distance. Instead, he was confronted by flesh, by breath, by another life pressing in on his own. She offered a tentative smile, the kind meant to soften tension, but only deepened his sense of being trapped. "I'll call the company," she said, almost pleading. "I'm sure they'll fix this." She stepped inside anyway, setting her bags down with care, her movements careful, deferential. But it was too late. His weekend was ruined. His retreat was broken. His solitude was gone. And as he stood there, staring at the stranger who had invaded his carefully constructed sanctuary, he felt the first flicker of something he couldn't yet name, the uneasy knowledge that he was stuck. Stuck, in the middle of nowhere, stuck in a cabin that was no longer his alone, stuck with her. The first hours in the cabin dragged on like days. It was a strange kind of silence, not the silence he had come for. Not the peaceful stillness of solitude, but a thick, awkward quiet, laced with tension, the kind that hung heavy in the air. Between two people who did not know what to do with each other, he occupied himself with the illusion of busyness, setting his laptop on the table as though work still tethered him. Though in truth, he barely touched the keys. He only tapped, idly at the trackpad now and then, just enough to make the screen glow, to give the impression that he was absorbed in something important. His eyes, however, slid again and again to the window, where the forest pressed against the glass, beautiful and unyielding, mocking him with the reminder that he was not alone in this sanctuary. He avoided looking at her. When she moved across the creaky wooden floorboards, he studied the grains in the table. When she set her bags down with a sigh, he tightened his grip on the mug of coffee he didn't want, but had made just for something to do. He could sense her presence without needing to look. The sound of her breathing, heavier than his own. The shuffle of her clothes when she bent to unzip something, the faint sweet fragrance of lavender that clung to her. Every reminder of her existence needled at him, drawing his attention when all he wanted was to retreat inside himself. She, on the other hand, seemed unwilling to let the air stay heavy for long. She tried, in her own way, to make conversation. Nothing invasive, nothing demanding. Simple questions, tossed like pebbles into a still pond. "Long drive up here?" she asked once, arranging her belongings in a corner. He nodded without lifting his gaze. "Cold out there, isn't it?" she ventured later, her tone light, almost cheerful. "Supposed to snow tonight, I heard." His reply was a muttered, "Maybe." Each word he gave was short, clipped, designed to close the door on any further exchange. He wanted to erect a wall, high and unbreachable, between himself and this stranger who had invaded his peace. In his mind, she was not a person to know, not someone to connect with. She was an obstacle, a living, breathing disruption of the solitude he had craved for weeks. He resented her without reason, resented the way her presence filled the room, the way her voice cut through the quiet he had come here to savor. And yet she persisted. not with the stubbornness of someone demanding attention, but with the quiet resilience of someone who had learned to live with resistance. She hummed softly as she unpacked, a tune that rose and fell without form, like something she had carried in her head for years. She offered a smile when their eyes briefly met, though he quickly looked away. She commented on the cabin, the coziness of the space, the charm of the old wooden beams, but her words fell flat against his indifference. The sun slid low in the sky, and shadows stretched long across the cabin floor. The air turned colder with each passing hour, the kind of chill that crept into the bones and made fingers stiff. The fireplace, meant to be the heart of warmth in the cabin, stood stubbornly lifeless. He had tried earlier to coax it into flame, stacking logs with a half-hearted precision, striking matches that fizzled before catching. He had given up after only a few attempts, frustrated, deciding instead to wrap himself in his coat and hunch over the glow of his laptop. But she had other ideas. As the temperature dropped and their breath began to fog faintly in the air, she rolled up the sleeves of her sweater and crouched in front of the hearth. He glanced at her then, if only because the movement drew his attention. She was methodical, not rushing as he had, but taking her time. She arranged the logs with care, then added smaller twigs and kindling, creating a careful nest. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done this before, who trusted patience more than force. He watched, though he didn't mean to. There was something about the way she leaned in close, striking a match with steady fingers, shielding the tiny flame with her palm as though protecting a fragile secret. The first attempt failed, smoke curling and vanishing into the air. She did not curse, did not frown. She only tried again, humming softly as though the act itself was a kind of song. The second flame caught, a thin lick of fire that wavered uncertainly. She coaxed it with gentle breaths, feeding it slowly, letting it lick at the twigs until they glowed. He found himself holding his breath without realizing it, as though the success of her effort mattered more than he wanted to admit. When the fire finally flared into life, crackling as it spread across the wood, warmth began to bleed into the room, chasing away the shadows. She sat back on her heels, face illuminated by the orange glow, eyes shining with quiet triumph. A small smile curved her lips, not directed at him, but at the fire itself, as though she had made a friend. And in that moment, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not just competence, not just determination, but a spark and energy that seemed to radiate from her, subtle yet undeniable. She was not the obstacle he had painted her as in his mind. She was not simply the woman who ruined his solitude. There was more to her, something unspoken but palpable, something that stirred uneasily within him. Though he tried to push it away, the fire crackled louder, throwing shadows across the wooden walls. The awkward silence between them softened, no longer so sharp, no longer so suffocating. And though he still sat on his side of the cabin, pretending to focus on his laptop, he could not keep from glancing at her again. Drawn by that spark, he did not yet understand. He had expected the awkwardness to fade after a few hours, maybe even after that first long evening in the cabin, but to his surprise, it lingered, clinging to the air like a heavy fog. At first, he told himself that the discomfort came only from the situation, from being trapped in a wooden box with a complete stranger when all he had wanted was silence and solitude. Yet, as the hours passed, he began to notice things. They were small at first, almost insignificant. The way she laughed at herself when she accidentally dropped a spoon. The way her voice softened when she spoke about the snow outside, as if she had a secret appreciation for the world that most people ignored. These little fragments of her being, so unassuming and quiet, pressed into his awareness, challenging the judgment he had carried into the cabin. He had seen her on the first evening through a lens of irritation. To him, she was an intrusion, someone who had stepped into a place that wasn't meant to be shared. But now, the edges of that perception began to blur. He found himself watching her when she thought he wasn't looking. There was no performance in her movements. She did not try to impress him, nor did she shrink away in embarrassment. She simply existed, and in that existence was something strangely disarming. On the second morning, the cabin smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. He rose later than usual, expecting to see her still half asleep or buried in her own thoughts. Instead, she was already bustling about, coaxing the stubborn fireplace to life with a patience he could never muster. She hummed under her breath as she worked, the tune unfamiliar but soothing, something between a lullaby and a hymn. He leaned against the doorway, silent, watching her until she finally noticed him and smiled. Not a grand, showy grin, but a simple curve of the lips that seemed to say, "I know this is uncomfortable, but maybe it doesn't have to stay that way." The smile unsettled him. He was not used to kindness that asked for nothing in return. In the city, everything was transactional, a favor given only if one could be expected back, a gesture of warmth offered only if it could be paraded before others. Yet here, in this quiet cabin, surrounded by wilderness, this stranger extended small courtesies without any demand. She offered him coffee without asking how he liked it, only to somehow get it right. She shifted her belongings to give him more space without a word of complaint. She filled the silence with little stories about places she had seen, about her grandmother's strange superstitions, about how snowstorms always reminded her of beginnings, rather than endings. Each word chipped away at the wall he had built. At night, when the wind howled against the windows and the fire sank low, he found himself listening, not just to her words, but to the cadence of her voice. It was warm, steady, grounding. Even when she spoke of things that might have sounded trivial, there was a depth in her tone that made them feel important. And though he tried to resist it, though he reminded himself that she was still a stranger, he began to look forward to those moments when she spoke, when the cabin no longer felt like a prison but something closer to companionship. What unsettled him most was not her presence, but his own shifting reaction to it. He had entered the cabin with a rigid image of who she was, based entirely on her appearance. He had thought of her as an obstacle, someone to endure until the rental company sorted out their mistake. But with every passing day, she dismantled that image, not through confrontation or argument, but through something far more disarming: sincerity. She was patient where he was restless, forgiving where he was sharp, lighthearted where he was weighed down. And so, he found himself in conflict. One part of him clung desperately to his initial judgment, unwilling to admit he had been wrong. Yet another part, quieter, but growing stronger, urged him to look closer, to let go of the shallow assumptions he had carried. That inner battle consumed him, keeping him awake long after she had gone to sleep. He would lie there, staring at the low wooden beams of the cabin ceiling, hearing the faint rhythm of her breathing from the other side of the room, and wonder why it all suddenly mattered so much. The storm outside had lost none of its fury. For days it had beaten against the wooden walls of the cabin, shrieking through the gaps like some restless spirit that refused to be silenced. Snow piled higher and higher against the windows, until the world beyond seemed erased, swallowed by endless white. For him, the man who had always sworn by solitude, the idea of being shut inside had once promised peace. But peace was not what he found. What he found instead was her, the stranger, the woman he had judged before he knew her name, the one whose presence had unsettled him from the first moment. He had thought her nothing more than an obstacle, someone to tolerate, someone whose existence infringed upon the quiet space he had carved for himself. In those first hours, even her breathing had irritated him, too loud, too steady, too constant. He had caught himself glaring when she moved across the small cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. His mind had latched onto words he would never have said aloud, cruel labels shaped by assumptions, by the harsh lens through which society had taught him to see people like her, obese, lazy, inconvenient. He had caged her inside those words, without ever looking at the truth beneath them. But something had shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. It began with small things: the way she had stacked the firewood carefully, ensuring it would last them longer than he might have planned. The way she had quietly mended the draft along the window with scraps of cloth, her hands steady, practical, as though she had been preparing for storms all her life. The way she hummed to herself while cooking simple meals from their limited supplies. The notes of her voice soft and surprisingly soothing against the relentless howl outside. Now, sitting near the firelight, he found himself watching her differently, not as an intruder, but as someone undeniably human, layered with stories he had never asked to hear, stories she was slowly beginning to share. That night she had spoken about her childhood, about the small town she came from, about afternoons spent helping her grandmother in a garden that was more wilderness than order. She painted it with such vividness that he could almost smell the damp soil, could almost see the wild roses that bloomed defiantly against frost. He caught himself smiling at her words, at the sparkle in her eyes when she described the way she used to talk to the flowers, as if they were friends. At first he had wanted to dismiss it, childish fantasy, naive nonsense. Yet the warmth in her voice anchored him, and against his will, he listened as though the tale were a secret map leading him somewhere he had long forgotten. He did not tell her, but as she spoke he thought of his own past, of a time when he, too, had believed in things unseen, of how the city, with its cold concrete and relentless pace, had stripped that from him, leaving only silence where wonder had once lived. When she finally paused, her gaze drifted to him, expectant but not demanding. And in that pause, words he had never intended to speak tumbled out. He told her about the city lights, about nights spent on rooftops staring at neon signs that felt more alive than the people beneath them. He told her about the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow, even in crowds, even in laughter. He told her how he had come to the mountains, not for adventure, but for escape, hoping the silence of snow might drown out the noise inside his head. He was not sure why he told her. He had never shared such things with anyone. Yet she listened without flinching, without pity, without the kind of awkwardness that often met confessions like his. She simply listened, her silence an invitation rather than a barrier. Her eyes did not look away, and in them he saw no judgment, no mockery, only patience, only presence. For a man who had built his life around walls, invisible, impenetrable walls, this was unsettling. But it was also strangely liberating. The words left him lighter, though the storm outside grew heavier still. He realized, as the fire crackled and her breathing filled the quiet, that for the first time in years he did not feel utterly alone. That realization frightened him more than the storm, because what did it mean to find comfort here? With her, the person he had dismissed, the stranger he had wanted nothing to do with. What did it mean that her laughter softened something in him, that her presence filled a space he hadn't known was empty? He lay awake that night, long after she had, curled up on her side of the cabin, her figure outlined by the faint glow of embers. Her breaths rose and fell, steady as waves. He listened, and to his surprise, the sound calmed him more than silence ever had. The storm clawed at the roof, the wind moaned through the trees, but it was her breathing that held him tethered, that lulled him toward sleep. And somewhere, deep inside, beneath layers of denial, beneath the remnants of prejudice and pride, something small began to bloom. It was not yet love, not yet trust, not yet anything he could name. But it was there, fragile, persistent, alive. The next morning, when he awoke, the storm had eased only slightly. A gray pall of silence lay over the snowbound world outside, broken only by the groan of trees bent beneath ice. He blinked groggily, the cabin still dim in the early light. The fire had burned low, little more than glowing embers now, and the air had a bite that made him pull the blanket closer around his shoulders. She was already awake. He noticed her sitting by the window, her back to him, bundled in a shawl that looked far too thin for the season. She held a mug in her hands, steam curling upward, and though she did not speak, there was a calmness to her presence that filled the small room. She was watching the snow, or maybe she was simply watching the silence itself. For a moment, he stayed still, not wanting to intrude on whatever private world she inhabited in that gaze. But then she turned slightly, just enough to notice him awake, and she smiled. It was not a grand smile, not one of those dazzling gestures people often wear like masks. It was small, quiet, but unshakably genuine. The kind of smile that disarmed without effort. "Morning," she said softly. He mumbled a return greeting, his voice rough with sleep, but something about that one word, spoken in her tone, settled in him like warmth spreading through cold limbs. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and glanced toward the pot she had placed over the embers. The smell of steeped herbs drifted faintly through the air, not coffee, not tea, but something rustic, something that carried the memory of earth. "You made this?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity he hadn't intended to show. She nodded, lifting the pot slightly. "My grandmother used to brew it when winters dragged on. Dried leaves, some bark, berries, if we had them. I had a small pouch in my bag, thought it might help." He hesitated, then accepted when she poured him a cup. The liquid was bitter, almost sharp, but beneath it lay a surprising sweetness that lingered at the edges of his tongue. It was not like anything he had tasted before, but it warmed him in ways coffee never had. "Not bad," he muttered, her grin widened. "Playful now. That's high praise, coming from you." The tease startled him. Days ago, he would have bristled, would have shut down, unwilling to let anyone playfully jab at his guarded exterior. But now he found himself smirking, shaking his head as if to hide the fact that her humor had landed. The hours that followed passed differently than before. Where once silence had hung between them, heavy and awkward, now it seemed softer, like a blanket rather than a wall. They spoke occasionally, small questions about their supplies, guesses about how long the storm might trap them, memories that surfaced unbidden. She told him about the first time she had ever seen snow, how she had been 12 years old, standing barefoot on a porch as white flakes dusted her hair, and how she had laughed until her stomach hurt. He told her about the opposite, about the first time he had seen the ocean, a vastness so blue it had made him dizzy, how he had felt both insignificant and infinite in its presence. These exchanges were not monumental, not dramatic, yet they carried a weight he could not ignore. They were threads, weaving something fragile but undeniable between them. By evening, the fire crackled again, casting golden light across her face as she sat cross-legged on the floor, mending one of his gloves with a needle she had produced from her bag. He watched her, not for the first time, with a sense of bewilderment. He had not asked her to do this. He had not expected her to be capable, much less willing. And yet, here she was, stitching quietly, her expression calm, her focus precise. "You didn't have to," he said after a while. She looked up, shrugging. "Maybe not, but it passes the time. And you need them more than I do." Her words struck him harder than he wanted to admit. They were simple, almost careless in their generosity, but they echoed in his chest long after she bent her head to the task again. That night, as snow once more rattled against the walls, he found himself restless. He lay awake, staring at the low ceiling, the firelight painting restless patterns across the wood. Her presence had become too vivid, too present. It was no longer possible to reduce her to the dismissive image he had once clung to. The cabin was too small for lies, too intimate for prejudice. He saw her, and in seeing her, he was forced to see himself. He hated it. He needed it. Sleep came late, and when it did, it carried with it dreams he had not expected. dreams of voices interwoven, of laughter against snow, of warmth blooming in places long frozen. When he awoke, it was to find her already moving again, tending the fire, checking the food stores, humming softly to herself, always humming. A tune he did not know, but one that had already carved itself into his bones, and he realized, with something like dread and wonder mingled together, that he was no longer waiting for the storm to end. He was waiting to see what she would do next.